Okay, so I'm looking at dress objects and the life course. So as some of you may know, I've had quite long-standing interests in dress objects. So the Petrie project was a great opportunity to see what's going on in Egypt as regards the dress material. And one of the really interesting things I think that we discovered when we were looking at the Petrie collection is that a lot of the material is very late antique. So we found that a lot of it had been categorized as Roman, but it was actually late antique. So that was another really interesting dimension, because you sort of get to see what happens next. You know, if we're familiar with the culture of Roman Britain or the Northwest provinces, we're used to a sort of end point more or less at the end of the 4th century. So it was really interesting to see how the styles develop and how things continue into the late antique period. So Jo's told you a bit about the Petrie project already, so I won't repeat what she said, but just to give you an idea of the data set that I was using for this particular study. So I was focusing mainly on the objects from the Petrie Museum. They have quite a substantial collection of dress objects. And then I also used some material from other collections as well. So the British Museum and some other museums around the UK. So tonight I'm going to talk mostly about bracelets, torcs and beads. So you get an idea on the screen there of the numbers of objects that we have in those particular categories. And these are mostly non-precious materials. So the Petrie does have a few silver and gold objects, but it's mostly these prosaic materials, glass, copper alloy and iron. And again, that's another really interesting thing, to be able to see what kind of iron jewelry was there, because that survives really well in the Petrie collection. So that's very nice. Okay, so as you've heard from Jo already, there's particular problems with these Egypt collections in museums because they're from early excavations, or there's poor recording of contextual information. But we do have a few published site reports for the Petrie collection, and from those we can get an idea of the kind of contexts that these dress objects are coming from. So the UCL material is mostly, we think, coming from burials that are individual grave cuts. So that was a great benefit, really, because we're not in that nightmare scenario of collective tombs where you have deposition over a long period into the same tomb, because you sometimes get that in the Middle East. But most of these Petrie ones, we think, were in these individual grave cuts. And there's a little bit of information from the site reports that tells us that the objects were either worn at burial or they were placed on the body. So that's useful information. And by looking at the objects themselves, we can see that these are everyday objects with evidence of wear. So for the most part, they don't seem to be goods made specially for burial. Jo did find one kind of shoe that she thought might have been made specially for burial. So you could ask her about that if you like, but most of the objects seem to be kind of ordinary everyday objects that were then included in the grave as well. Okay, so what sort of theoretical or interpretive perspectives am I using? Well, obviously there's been a lot of valuable work done on the life course by Mary Harlow and Ray Lawrence, and also Montserrat has done work on the life course in Roman Egypt. So I was very dependent on that work, and bringing that perspective to dress objects, I think, was quite a fruitful one. And then in tandem with this, I've also been drawing on approaches from design theory, which I explored in a bit of detail in my previous book, especially in relation to two particular ideas. So firstly, the idea of affordances, the features of objects that make possible and facilitate particular uses. So a seat has a flat surface for sitting on, it's that simple. And then secondly, design assumptions. So this is the way that the producers of objects make objects with a particular user group in mind. So often this is in relation to age and gender. We can see the intended user of the object manifest in the design of that object. And of course, dress objects, because they're worn in relation to the human body, which changes through the life course, are very useful objects to examine from a life course perspective. So dress objects are sometimes scaled to body sizes, and that shows something of the design assumptions which have been made about the intended users of objects. I've also drawn a bit on anthropological studies. So there's quite a lot of very useful studies of traditional societies which explore how costume and dress objects were extensively used to construct and communicate life course identities, and particularly playing important roles in life course stages relating to fertility, sexual activity, and marriage. So if we think about the life course stages in Roman culture, looking at Harlow and Lawrence's work, we have different stages for infants and children, and then for adolescents and older adults. And we can see also in Roman culture, marriage is important in defining the adult life course stage for females. So it kind of propels you into an adult status. So we can try and use this, and we can try and evaluate what particular objects may be related to some of these different life course stages. So from both modern anthropological studies and from research on the ancient world, we can see that dress objects are important to construct and communicate identities. And of course, they may have been an important component in ritual transitions between different life course stages. They could also be used to protect people, and they could be used to ground people in the new social identity that they would take on as they grew up. So the nature of the archaeological evidence rarely allows us to make a completely unambiguous connection between dress objects and specific life course rituals, but we can at least suggest which types of more everyday artifacts are likely to have been important in which life stages, and discuss how they may have functioned. So in this paper today, I'm going to focus mostly on bracelets and torcs, which are scaled to body sizes, and also talk a bit about necklaces. And I don't think I've got time to go into other types of objects. So let's have a look at the bracelets first. So of course, the way to look at bracelets from a life course perspective is to evaluate the sizes of those bracelets, because of course, children will have much smaller bracelets than adults will. So that's the first thing that I did. I measured the internal diameter of these bracelets to see what the sort of profile is. And we can see for the Egypt data here, there's a large peak at the small end of the size range. So I don't know if you can sort of see on your tiny camera, but I've got a little children's bracelet here. So you can see sort of what sort of size these things are. So the smallest category is less than 4 centimeters in diameter. And there's a lot of bracelets that are in those very small sizes. So these bracelets are mostly from burials. And of course, wouldn't it be great if we could sort of look at the burial data, look at the physical anthropology of the skeleton, and compare the age from the physical anthropology and compare that to the diameter of the bracelet that's included in the grave? That would be a lovely thing to be able to do. But of course, because of the difficult data set that we have from Egypt, that's not really possible. A lot of these bracelets don't even have a grave number attached to them, let alone being attached to other burial records for the complete grave assemblage, including the skeletal data. So the approach that I had to take here was a comparative one. Like Joe, I looked at some data from Roman Britain, which is very well published, very well recorded. So I looked at data from published reports, Winchester and Colchester, and both of those have very good data on the age from the skeletal remains. And then they also have good data of the inner diameters of these bracelets. So this is the picture that I got from the British data. And you can see that these bracelets peak at different age ranges. So for infants up to 7 years, we can see there's a strong peak in this 30 to 39 diameter, and then older children have a peak at 40 to 49. And then adolescents and adults have a similar pattern with bracelets in bigger sizes. So we can get an idea from this of how our sizes from Egypt are likely to map onto the likely age ranges of the people wearing them. So looking back at our Egypt data again, I think we can see that we have about 65% of these bracelets from Egypt are being made in infants and children's sizes. And then we have only about 35% that are being made in adolescent and adult sizes. And that's rather different actually to the data from Roman Britain, where it's not so popular to have these bracelets in tiny sizes for children. So what are these bracelets for? Why are children given these bracelets? Well, we've seen this piece of evidence already, actually, because Jo showed us this nice quotation from John Chrysostom. So she talked about the red thread, but we can also see from this that bracelets could be used to suspend amulets. So he talks about bells hung upon the hand And we've actually got some of these bells in the Petrie collection. So there are 5 of these tiny bracelets, the right sizes for children, for very young children, and they have these bells attached to them. So it looks very much as if this is what Chrysostom is talking about, and the dates match very well because these are 4th century styles in bracelets. Just interesting to note from the evidence on the bracelet, we can see from the wear on them that these things have been used together. So they haven't just added on the bell when the burial took place. That bell has been on that bracelet for a long time. You can see how it's worn down. And of course, it seems likely from that extreme wear pattern on that example that this bracelet would have been passed down the family, perhaps to many successive children. So as children grew up, their hands would get bigger and they wouldn't be able to wear these bracelets anymore. They wouldn't fit. So it's very likely they're passed down in the family and worn by very many successive children at the infant life stage. Something else that we did with these bracelets is we made some replicas. So another part of the project was to make replicas of musical instruments and see what they sounded like. That's a whole different talk. But just to say, we did make replicas of these ones with the bells on the bracelets. And we found they made a very, very quiet sound. And some of the adults we tried these out on couldn't actually hear them. So that's very interesting because it shows that the affordances of the objects suit a very young child, because of course young children have much better hearing than adults do. So that was just quite a nice little window onto how these objects may have been experienced. Now, quite surprisingly, actually, the other object that seems to be associated with children in the Egypt collection is torcs. And there's not so many of these, so we don't have a very big data set at the moment, but there's certainly very few in other museum collections. So the Petrie has the biggest collection of this kind of data. And they have very late date ranges. There's one usefully that has a coin set into the front, so we can get the date and do some stylistic comparisons as well. And we've got a bit of a glimmer of information because the site report information that we have says that these are sometimes buried with children. And of course, that seems a surprise because when we think about late antique torcs, we think about the picture on the right, which is from the Ravenna mosaic, and it's Justinian's Germanic bodyguard wearing torcs. And that's the kind of context in which people talk about late antique torcs. They connect them very much with adult male military culture, masculine culture, Germanic culture. But in Egypt, it's clear that there's something quite different going on. So again, because these objects are scaled to body size, we could have a look at the sizes of these torcs to see who has been wearing them. And in particular, there's a kind of torc that you can't fully open. It's this kind of torc with an expanding fastening. So you can only pull it apart a little way to put it over your head. And then the other type has a hook and eye fastening. So with the ones that go over your head, then obviously the size of your skull is going to be important. And then for the ones that go around your neck, clearly the neck size is going to be important. So it was those sorts of measurements that we were thinking about. So I got some neck measurements from modern data because you can't really get ancient data on that. But for the head data, I was able to use skulls. So I got some data on skulls and the age range of those skulls. I managed to get one set of immature skull data, not from Roman Egypt, unfortunately, but apparently this data set was quite similar to skeletal remains from Roman Egypt. And then my other data set was from Roman Egypt, and that was for females. So that's including immature as well as adults. And when you compare the length of the skull with the diameter of the torc, we can see very quickly that most of our torcs actually wouldn't fit over an adult-sized head. So particularly the ones here with the white circles, those are the ones with the expanding fastening where you can't actually unhook it and open up the circle. So those ones do need to fit over your head. So we can see from this data then that these torcs, far from being military masculine objects, they were actually worn. A lot of them were worn by children. They do exist in adult sizes, but there's also a bias to children in the data set. So just summing up on dress objects for children, we can make draw some conclusions from this section. So we can see that these types of objects are worn particularly by children, and they may have important functions in socialization and also in protection. So of course, children are very vulnerable in the ancient world. We know that from the demographic data that we have. So protection is a very obvious function. But of course, socialization is important as well. So newly born infants, as Montserrat discusses, need to undergo a successful transition to being a social being. So an obvious stage in that transition would be dressing the body in clothing and conferring on it objects, showing that the child is valued and is accepted into society. And in Egypt, this may have occurred after the first 40 days of life or the first year of life. We know these were ritual thresholds for Roman Egypt. And the size of some of our torcs and bracelets suggests that they were given to infants at around that particular stage. What about older people? So I'm conscious time is pressing on. Well, we can see that older people obviously wore multiple suites of dress objects. So of course, we have the famous data from the mummy portraits, which other scholars have discussed before me. And we can see quite clearly that the younger people in these mummy portraits have these elaborate ensembles of jewelry. And then, of course, jewelry becomes important as a dowry item as people get older. So we can also see that there's some evidence from papyri studied by Ogden, which shows that particular objects are popular for dowry items. So one of the objects that's popular is gold earrings in particular. They often seem to have been given for a dowry. So those would be important to communicate a particular kind of status. And then we also have necklaces and hairpins. So on the slide there is one of the great things in the Petrie collection. So we can see we've got this hairpiece and it still has the hairpins in it. And you can just see how many hairpins would have been worn at the same time. And that's the kind of data that we don't really get for Roman Britain. So it's lovely to be able to see that. And it really changes our view of, how people used objects in the ancient world. Okay, so thinking about these other types of jewelry, then necklaces, earrings, things like that, as being connected to a more adult status, a status of approaching marriage, betrothal, and then being a married woman. And of course, other people have worked on this already. So they've looked at the way jewelry occurs in burials. And it's widely agreed that the occurrence of a lot of jewelry with young girls in Roman burials relates to their status as unmarried girls who have been given a kind of token jewelry that would have been appropriate to them as brides in their unattained future. So that's something that's been explored by multiple authors. It's quite well established. And there's been studies of Roman Egypt as well, which have come to the same conclusion. So that's by Nena there. And I also managed to find quite an interesting little clip from Byzantine source. So we have this source, the life of Saint Menas, and it tells us about the mother of Saint Menas. And the mother of Saint Menas is infertile and she's grieving and envious. And she's envious when she sees other women carrying their children and wearing their jewelry. So it's really nice the way those two things are juxtaposed in this source. And it seems to show us that the possession of jewelry was maybe something that was also associated with being a mother. So perhaps people gained new items of jewelry with the birth of successive children. And of course, we can see from anthropological studies that costume and dress objects were very important in these kinds of life course stages related to courtship, marriage, and fertility rituals. Okay, pressing on. What about older adults? Well, here we see quite a contrast because if you look at the mummy portraits that show women with grey hair, there aren't very many, but some of them do show women with grey hair, and they have much less jewelry. So they might have a single pair of earrings, but they don't have any necklaces or anything like that. And if you look at the papyri evidence, then we can see from dowry lists that sometimes mothers would have given jewelry to their daughters. So it seems quite an easy transition to make, doesn't it? So as women grow older, it becomes inappropriate for them to be wearing such a lot of jewelry. So the obvious thing to do would be to give it to their daughters as they grow up and are ready to get married. And there may be a little bit of archaeological evidence for this in bead necklaces. So I looked at some bead necklaces from the Petrie Museum where I think perhaps we can see this kind of thing happening because there's evidence of these being heirloom beads. So these are amber beads. And fortunately, because they're coming from Northern Europe, we've got secure dates because obviously they're found in grave contexts in Northern Europe. So we think the production dates of these are 5th century. And then we do have a few sort of small assemblage of graves in the Petrie Museum where we actually know that each object belongs within a particular grave context. And I've been able to date those contexts by using the beads and the other evidence in the graves. And I think what we can see is necklaces, which are heirloom items, because we sometimes find almost complete necklaces or significant portions of necklaces which seem to occur in burial contexts that are hundreds of years later than the original production of the beads. So it's a possibility, of course, that these bead necklaces were passed down in families from mother to daughter, perhaps, and then if somebody died prematurely, maybe the necklace would be buried with them instead of being passed on again in the family. So that's just a tiny glimpse of some of the research that we're doing and how I've tried to relate the life course stages to particular items of jewelry. So I think we've seen that infants and younger children wore things like bracelets and torcs, and these will have had functions for socialization and protection. And then of course, for fertile women reaching childbearing age, then obviously jewelry would be very important to embody fertility, marriage status and motherhood. And then conversely, for older women, fewer dress objects would indicate a post-childbearing age. And I've also tried to show how dress objects would be passed around in families. So both maybe mothers giving objects to daughters, but also perhaps child-size objects being passed down in a family from one child to the next, as we see perhaps with this bracelet that we see on the right there. So if you're interested to find out more, both about Jo's research and about mine, here's our book, which is out this week. So I hope some of you may be interested in that. And I think Stephen has already circulated a flyer which gives you a discount off that book. So thanks very much for your attention.